Let's talk about plan rendering. And by this, I mean the kind of renderings that you do on a design board. These floor plans tend to be the kind of linchpin that explains how you're organizing your project, and it's important to make the graphics as legible and as expressive as possible. So why not just export the view from Revit? Come on. Well, the biggest problem is that the views in Revit, and here we have one, they're just not that nice. I mean, the dot patterns are ugly. Some materials will render nicely, some not so nicely. And Photoshop allows you a lot more control. Now here's an example from the Pinterest page I have set up for this assignment. And one of the things you can do in Photoshop, you can really have a crisp looking material. You just don't always get that in Revit, even in the realistic views. You can also add in drop shadows to give a little bit of depth, particularly around your furniture and also your walls. And of course you can add in things like titles. You can add those after and make them more consistent in terms of font and font size. And here's another example. Again, you can get a repeat pattern on your materials that is much more realistic than you can get directly out of Revit. Finally, you can add in some things that sometimes need touch-up in Revit, such as this is a realistic view. It's actually a rendered view, but you often need Photoshop to kind of touch that up and add back in things like line weights. The process for rendering your floor plan is going to be the same as for our diagrammatic renderings, which is to say you're going to export a number of different types of views from either Revit or SketchUp. Especially if you're fond of the SketchUp sketchy lines, you can just export your model from Revit into DWG format and then open it in SketchUp. And for this project, you can also just go and open SketchUp and find a model that you like, and you can modify the views and export them from there. One big difference from that previous project is that this drawing will be set to scale, and that's why it's important to have a graphic scale, which is pictured here. I just drew it using filled regions, and I have posted this to Canvas in case you want to copy and paste it into your plan view. And of course, there's also a north arrow. You'll notice that there is no text. We will add that later on. Well, in Revit, things are actually a little different, as you might imagine. First of all, we have ready-made plan views in Revit. We don't need to go to Layout or some other program. And we can set the scale in advance. So this is a lot easier. Choose a scale that makes sense for your project and your board. If you're not sure how big that plan will be at that scale, you can just select the crop region, which shows up in your plan, and choose size crop. And there you will find out exactly how physically large the plan will be. And if you change the scale, it will change the size, and you can kind of design your board in advance based on your knowledge of how much space you have to get your plan in. You'll also want to set the visibility settings in advance. Of course, if you want a shaded view like this one, you might want to also consider not making it shaded because sometimes the colors look a little funny. If you have already applied materials, of course, you can use the realistic view. You can turn on shadows in the sun, or you can just go with a hidden line view. You also want to change the detail level to make sure it shows what you want. Typically for a plan, you just want poche, so choose the coarse view. If I were to make that medium, for example, notice how the poche goes away. But I want the poche. Even if I want to change the color later on, you'll notice some of the poche here is not the right color, so I'm going to need to Photoshop that. The Adobe PDF, the beauty of it is you can go to the properties of the printer and choose quality settings which are going to help you. So for example, standard is just, well, standard. But we can choose high quality print because we're all about high quality. And of course, you can always back off and make the image smaller, but you want as many pixels as possible initially. The other thing is you can choose a paper size. I know how big my plan is going to be. It's about 22 inches so in both dimensions. So I'm going to choose Arch D, 24 by 36. And that makes sure that my image goes onto an entire sheet. It won't be divided up amongst multiple pages of a PDF. Anyway, I don't want to see it afterwards. I'm just going to open it in Photoshop. So you click OK and save your image. Now, a thing which is very handy to do when you're exporting your layers from Revit is to do things like export just the furniture or just the walls. Now, how do you do that? Well, you go to your handy-dandy Visibility and Graphic Overrides menu. I just type in VG to get that menu. And I'm going to select all layers and turn them all off. Then I'm going to select no layers and just turn on the furniture. And apply, and OK. And you could absolutely turn on the sun and get some shadows in here and export this image as is, but I like to do the drop shadows in Photoshop. But exporting just these elements are going to make for a very handy-dandy layer in Photoshop. Anyway, after exporting multiple layers with different content, again, typically the full plan, I usually do an empty plan with the walls and the floors and the furniture, and then I will export an empty plan with nothing in it, no colors, no patterns, with just walls, and then other times I will just do the furniture. Depending, again, on what sort of thing you're looking for. You could also just export floors if you know you're going to be doing a lot of flooring patterns. Again, you'll want to just look at your project and make a decision there. Now, there is one other way that you can export your plan view from Revit. And I'm going to go to, this is the 3D view of my model. The nice thing about this type of view is it can be rendered. Now, I can go here to my render dialog box, and I'm going to just try a draft render using the screen. That's not a lot of pixels, so it shouldn't take too long. And typically, I use exterior sun only. I have found that basically interior sun only and exterior sun only look about the same when you render them on the cutaway axonometric type of view. Wow, that was fast. Actually, I cut away. It took about, I don't know, 30 seconds to render the image. And of course, you can see pretty fast if you like the way the shadows are. You can adjust the shadows using Revit's render controls, either turning them on and off or whatnot, depending on your preferences. Again, just depends on how your model is structured, what kind of shadows you're going to get. So this rendering, if it's working okay, that's of course not a very high quality image. We're going to want to do a much higher one. For that, unless you have a very fast computer, you're going to want to render in the cloud. So let's call up our cloud rendering process here. I've already tested it, so I know it's going to work pretty well. So this is where you're going to want to go to the much higher quality setting. I'm going to go to the maximum size, basically. And I'll leave the exposure settings on the automatic kind of method. Advanced means automatic. Native is it'll take the settings on your computer. Anyway, then click render, and you can come back and get it from the internet. And as you can see, the little gnomes at the Revit Internet Rendering Cloud have been very busy. And what's nice about the internet is the internet rendering is, of course, it saves you a tremendous amount of time. You can also re-render in case you didn't set it to the highest possible resolution. Now, in our case, I did set it to the maximum, which is 4,000 pixels. And basically, with any rendered image, you want as many pixels as you can possibly get. And this is the maximum that they will allow you. And of course, the final quality is what you want. So I'm all set. I don't need to re-render it. I just need to download it. Now, when you download from the render cloud, you'll have to decide if you want the transparent background or not. In my case, the transparent background, that's this gray area here. There's nothing there. The model is empty. So I want to turn that on. It'll mean that when it comes into Photoshop, I won't have to do any extra cropping for that particular area. It does limit your type of images that you can have. Again, PNG is my preferred, just to keep the file size under control. Really, the best way to export from SketchUp
is to make sure that you put the file into a layout project. And here I have a layout file. And there you can, once the model is in that project, if you've set up your drawing to be orthographic, from the top view, then you can just set it to one of the standard scales. Now that it's in layout and the scale is set correctly, you can just export this guy as a PDF file. Just choose PDF file, and again, with every export operation, you can choose the resolution. With a floor plan, absolutely choose the highest resolution, the lowest amount of distortion, or highest quality. Once you do that, that image file that you create, a PDF is basically an image file, will remember that it is exactly the correct size for your work. The other thing that I like to do, because again there's sometimes confusion about getting these drawings to scale, is I like to put a graphic scale. This is actually a component in SketchUp that you can move around. That graphic scale, of course, is to scale, and that way when you export the image file of your floor plan, the scale will go with it, which means that if you mess up somehow with your math, if somewhere along the way you accidentally change the image size, at least the graphic scale will be resized with the image. All right, so let's quit out of SketchUp, and I'm not going to save that, and we'll go to our.
So we are finally ready to bring our exports into Photoshop. And I'm going to open up the hidden line floor plan view first. And what you'll see, by the way, when you open in Photoshop, you'll see a preview. If it's a multi-page PDF, you'll have to pick a page and make sure it is not set to bounding box. You see how it will crop it to the floor plan, but we just want to leave it at the media box. This will leave it at the original 24 by 36 Arch D size. You do, however, want to change the resolution to 200 pixels per inch. And you'd say, well, why am I giving up my lovely pixels? The reason is that this will make the file size just a little bit smaller, and that's very helpful when you are working on a laptop. The other reason that we want to keep that original size is when we go to place our other layers, and I'm going to place this layer with the shadows on it. Click place. It will remember the original size, assuming you use the correct box here, and click OK, and it will plop the new one right on top of the old one. And if you remember, these come in as layers. These layers do need to be rasterized, so you can just right-click on them and rasterize them, and that will allow you to make modifications. You can turn them on and off and the like. The only view that's going to be tricky, and this is why I don't always use the rendered view, is the rendered view. And the reason is because it's not rendered onto a 24 by 36 sheet. It is rendered onto whatever size came out of the cloud. It's a pixel dimension, not a physical dimension. So we are going to need to adjust this when it comes in. You just choose File, Place Embedded, and browse for your rendered image. Photoshop will try to squeeze it in to the boundaries that it sees. As you can see, we've got two layers here. I'm going to drag the layer with the plan, the rendered plan, underneath the other image. And I'll make this image here, which has transparency on. I'm going to make this image have a blending mode that is multiply. And now I can select the rendered plan. As you can see, my plans are obviously not in kind of the same position, although they do look like they're about the same size. I can move by clicking and dragging. I can also use the arrow key to basically nudge this image up and down. You may have to use the transformation controls to make it slightly bigger or smaller. As you can see, I'm off here just a little bit as we go up into the drawing. For that, I'm going to have to grab one of those transformation controls and just kind of stretch it down. Be sure that you don't hold down Shift so that it locks the proportion of X and Y and see if you can stretch it into position. And you can see this looks pretty close. It looks like everything is matching up pretty well.
Friends over at Photoshop. And here I have a Photoshop document with a number of layers that I've created from my original document. And I believe I used Revit to create most of these, although actually I have a couple from SketchUp just to show you. Revit, if you're not familiar, it does have some sketchy line options in it. I exported one plan view with some sketchy lines, one view with just the furniture. And again, you can do this in SketchUp or Revit by hiding other elements. Typically, I isolate the furniture because I like to have a shadow on it, and you can't really do that when everything else is around. I also had the flooring in here. Not sure how I'm going to work my rendering here, so just have a couple of layers to experiment with. Another sketchy plan. Here's just a sharp version of the walls. Again, I can put a drop shadow in there if I want. I have a rendered view of the floor plan. Again, sometimes the rendering comes out pretty well out of Revit, but it lacks some of the definition that you get when you have a rendered view of the plan. It loses the line work. Sometimes the shadows don't have a proper definition. So I treat that as another sort of layer in my palette. If you would rather, SketchUp also has a lot of graphic control, a little more than in Revit, so you can get some more sketchy sketch lines in SketchUp. This one's a marker, I believe, and white on black. So, you know, there's a few more toys to play with when you are using SketchUp. Anyway, and then I have a blurred view of the main floor plan. So let's just start here. First of all, whenever you import images, whenever you place images in a Photoshop document, you know, you're going to open these all up and place them in here. So you go to the File, pull-down menu, and Place Embedded. What it will do is it still kind of links back to that original file. So you want to rasterize that layer. What that does is it just converts it to pixels that exist in this Photoshop document, which make it easy to modify. All right, now I'm going to start with just this drawing here that's fully rendered to show you an example of the simplest form of rendering, which is really you just take an already rendered image and add back in some of the things that you think might be missing. In this case, maybe I'll add in the lines, which are nice and dark. But of course, when I turn that layer on, this one that says Revit Plan Walls, it blocks out the layer below. To make it show through, you can use this blending mode. So I've selected the layer, and I choose this blending mode here. There's one called Multiply, and what that does is anything that is black in this layer becomes completely opaque. No pixels show through it. Anything that's white becomes completely clear. It basically disappears and shows all the pixels of whatever's below it. And then if something is gray, it shows it based on the percentage of grayness. So when I choose that, you see how my plan shines through very nicely. I even get some funky dashed lines in there. I still think the plan is a little bit heavy for my use. Now, if I start modifying this plan, I better make a copy of it so that I don't mess up the original, because I never know if I'm going to mess it up badly or not. So all you do is right-click on the layer and choose Duplicate. And of course, it will be called Copy. I'm going to turn off the original. Now on this copy, the simplest thing you can do is just drop the opacity down, and that tends to soften the layer just a little bit, tend to soften the rendering, because often these renderings are just a little bit too aggressive in their coloration. The density of the pixels is a bit strong. Another little trick that you can do to soften it is you can select an area and just render a small swatch. Maybe I'll use a polygonal lasso here, and I'll just select, say, a small swath to render here. And maybe I will even feather it. By right-clicking on the selection, I can choose this feather option. Feathering softens the perimeter of that selection. And now on this copy, if I just delete that section, you see how I can leave a section that's unrendered? Now, I don't really like it that way. I think I want to reverse that. I want to select all the other parts of this colored image and delete those. And now I can just have one section of the plan that is rendered. And that tends to be a little less graphically heavy on your boards. And you can even use other selection tools to trim this out to give it a sharper look, if you prefer. Now, obviously, this is one very simple technique, and I really didn't even do all that much to this rendered plan, but you can see that already that's a much softer view than this. This is really a dense image on your board. It's a lot harder to talk about than if you just have a small swatch that's rendered. Okay. Now, another thing that people like to do is they like to use that colored rendered image. Turn this back on. But they use a similar technique on this layer. They try to have this blurred background. Again, you can lower the opacity so it's a little softer. But then you can come in and turn back on something like the furniture. And again, maybe a blending mode will work for me here. Whoops, wrong layer. Turn back on the furniture. And when you overlay that sharp furniture and the sharp walls with the blurred area, that also can look very nice. Now, let's say you want the furniture to have even more definition. I can come back in here, go back to my normal blending mode. But maybe if I get rid of all this white area so that just the furniture is white, that'll really emphasize it. To do that, I need to use the Magic Wand tool. I like the Magic Wand tool. And the way it works is when you click on a pixel, it tries to select every pixel that looks just like the one that you clicked on. So if I click over here, this is a white area. Now, right now, when I click on that, what you'll see is it's basically selected every area that touched that original pixel that is white. That's because I have this contiguous button checked. If I didn't, and I went here and did this, now it would select every white pixel on the screen. I could also sample all layers. I absolutely don't want to do that either. I'm going to come back, just select the white pixel area around the furniture, and just hit delete. And now you can see that the image really emphasizes the furniture. Now, and again, not everybody likes this look, but obviously the aesthetics of your project are going to drive how you produce each of these layers. Now, okay, so that's using the rendered background image. Turn that off for a second. There are other simple things that you can do to render your plan. Even if it's just a black and white plan, you can take this layer and add a special layer style called drop shadow. And what this does, I'll call up the drop shadow menu, it will put what's called a drop shadow, a shadow off to one side of whatever it is that you've selected. Now, this layer, that I have applied this to, I only have the furniture visible. Remember, I deleted the background. So that's how you can get a drop shadow on just the furniture. If I hadn't done that, I would have a drop shadow just on the perimeter of the image because it's looking for basically places where there are no pixels, and that's where it will put the drop shadow. Anyway, there are a number of features that you can control on a drop shadow, and you can actually get quite a nice result here just by playing around with the sliders, and of course the scale of your furniture and the scale of your plan are going to determine to a large extent how you're going to apply that. But that's actually quite a nice way to get a shadow on your plan. Now, let's say that you don't have any rendered layer here. You're just experimenting with different materials, and you want to try to, I don't know, experiment with maybe wood flooring in parts of your project. One thing that you can do, and let me turn off this layer here. one thing that you can do is look for an image of a wood flooring. And when you search for images, make sure that you use the word seamless for your search term, one of your search terms, whatever it is, if it's tile or ceramic tile or whatever. That seamless texture, if you look carefully, the joint here between the wood matches perfectly with the bottom side. So when this image is kind of copied over on itself multiple times, it will basically not look like there are any joints whatsoever. Now there are some unrealistic parts about this. For instance, the wood flooring could end up being really, really long because there's no limit to it. Anyway, if you select this image, open the Photoshop image in Photoshop, select everything in the image, you can go to the Edit menu and choose Define Pattern. And defining a pattern, it'll ask you for the name, and I'll call it wood flooring. I don't know, number 1. And what that means, let me go back to my plan. If I want to paint an area of my drawing, here's my paint bucket. Normally it paints whatever the foreground color is. So I could come in here, you know, and paint this area red. Oh, except I need to be on the right layer. And it would paint it red. And what it would do is similar to the magic wand. The part that I click on, as long as contiguous is selected, it will look for any pixels that look just like that one, and it will keep going until it reaches some boundary of a pixel that doesn't look like the one I clicked on, and it will stop at that boundary. Okay. Now, red is not exactly a terribly nice color, and what I want to do, if I'm going to paint kind of manually a floor plan area, what I'll do, I'll make a new layer first. I'm just going to click the Create New Layer button down on the lower right of my screen. And you know, I could even call that flooring or something like that. The reason I want to do that is now when I use the paint bucket, and let's say I go and do the same operation here, I'll check this All Layers button up top. Now I'll paint, my paint will land on this flooring layer, but it will look for boundaries on all layers. There's a whole lot of layers, only one of them is on. Either way, I end up with the same result, but now I can turn on and off the paint layer or fiddle around with its opacity or apply filters or other fun things to it. Okay, now actually I really don't want to paint it red, so let me paint it another color. And basically, normally it paints the foreground color. I can paint it a pattern. Right up here in the top bar menu, I can choose the option. There are a whole number of patterns that are kind of already in Photoshop, and you can go and there's all sorts of pattern libraries that you can get. Anyway, when you add a new pattern, I just created one with this wood. I can click on it and it becomes something I can paint into my space. Now, probably it's going to not be the right size. Like when I click that, to scale, that looks probably a little wide, I would have to guess. I don't have my graphic scale, but those boards look a little wide to me. So I could just paint on this layer if I knew it was the right size. If not, what I can do is select the area I want to paint. Oh, and make sure I have sample all layers. And then I can create a new layer called a pattern layer. And what it will do is it will use whichever pattern I choose. But now, because I'm a little, I think it's a little too big, I can change the scale to be a little bit smaller. This is probably more like your typical oak strip flooring. I can also link it to other layers and make it snap to an origin or other places like that. But either way, when I do this, now I have this wood flooring that I have painted at the right scale. It's on a separate layer, so as before, I have my controls over opacity. If I want to tone it down just a tad, I can erase part of it, you know, erase a feathered selection. And of course, I can turn back on some of the other elements, such as my furniture with the lovely dropped shadow. Another fun technique that you can do This is a very photorealistic technique. Some of you are more artsy-fartsy. You can look for seamless images of things like watercolor. Select it all, Command A or Control A, and go like we did before and define a new pattern. And then when you go to your plan drawing, maybe you select an area and you paint it with that cool watercolor. And again, you just go to the paint bucket, wherever that is, and you choose the pattern that you created. And like before, I'm not going to paint directly. I'm going to use this special pattern adjustment layer with the area pre-selected. And that way I have the option to fiddle around with the scale, because you just never know what's going to look good. Sometimes really big actually looks kind of nice. It has this very artsy-fartsy effect. It does look a little funny with such a sharp edge to it. Like before, I could try to come in here and fiddle around with the opacity, maybe make it look a little softer. But another technique, if I want to try and use that selective deletion option, where I select an area, and maybe I try to delete the perimeter here. The way that I did that last time, I chose feather, choose some radius. 50 is probably good for something like this. Right now, that's selecting the middle. I want to actually select the inverse so that now this area here is selected. Again, just right-click on it to select it. But the problem is it won't let me do it. If I hit the delete button, see this message pops up. It's because this is a special adjustment layer. What I need to do is right-click on the layer and choose Rasterize. And this will basically flatten the layer so that it's easier to modify. And now I can just hit the delete button and it softens that edge. Maybe that's not perfect, but it does kind of give you a more artsy effect. One last little flourish that you can add to your floor plan is to add, say, a drop shadow or poche to your walls. Adding drop shadow is basically the same as we did before with the furniture. The trick is find your walls layer, and you're going to want to delete the floor area, because if I just make a drop shadow on this layer now, go to layer, layer style, drop shadow, nothing happens because it treats this whole thing as one giant image, so there's probably a drop shadow way down at the bottom. What I need to do is delete areas of the floor or even the outside that I think should have a shadow on them. I'll just select them, delete them, and you can see here this crosshatch pattern, kind of checkerboard pattern in the background. That's Photoshop's way of telling you that there are no pixels in those areas. Now, when I go and I apply the drop shadow, again, layer, layer style, drop shadow, I should see a nice shadow showing up. And again, you can change any number of features about it, make it darker, bigger, etc., etc. Change the angle. That's a very nice feature. And of course, when you add back in the furniture, the shadow goes on top, or add in the flooring, the shadow goes on top of that, depending on your layer stacking, of course. The other thing that I think looks really nice is adding poche to the walls. Of course, you can poche black or white or some hatch pattern. The big thing is creating a new layer first. Just like I did before, make sure it's on top of the plan layer. It's not absolutely critical. We can change blending modes and things to make it look right. But then when you're on the new layer, use your paint bucket. And again, make sure, as we did before, that in this case, all layers is selected. Now, the only trick, and this is often a point of confusion, you might think that this, having the drippy part of the paint bucket over your wall will paint it, but in fact it does not do that. What it does It's the cursor, the actual pointer part, not the dumpy part of the bucket. So you can see now I can click using just the tip of the cursor, and I can fill in those walls quite easily. And as before, because this is on a separate layer, I can tweak down the opacity, or I could even make this a color rather than gray or black and white.
So there are quite a few techniques that I'm not going to show you this time around, because I showed you during our last assignment the diagrammatic rendering project. And these include things like adding in some abstract texture in the background. That texture can be masked out using a layer mask. These are quick and easy techniques that we already used in the previous assignment. Also adding in text or arrows as need be. I won't show you that. So I will encourage you to go and find a plan rendering either from my own Pinterest examples or from your own internet research. Find a style that you like and try to emulate that. You will, of course, want to make sure you follow the assignment, which is in our revised syllabus. And the main objective of this assignment is to learn to render a floor plan using Photoshop, so obviously that would be important to do that. But beyond that, I'm expecting a certain amount of creative interpretation so that the plan is interesting and dramatic, just like our previous assignment. This also is a single board, and of course you will be submitting it electronically.